Okay. All right. Well, welcome, guys. Today, we've I know we've taken a turn on the previous book, and we started Ibn Arabi's Bezels of Wisdom. And since we made a switch in the reading plan, we decided to cover all of Adam today. Um, I know a lot of the questions that me and Chitan and Davud were talking about had to do with, how does one how does one become like a mirror, um and I think I think I was able to find that answer ironically outside of the text, but I think that's something I'll bring up later on. Right now there's something that actually came up to my mind on in the very beginning. I'll read it on page 48. It's about before it goes into, like, it does like a little breakdown before the Adam chapter. It says, thus the names, including the supreme name, have relevance or meaning only within the context of the polarity, divinity, cosmos, and Adam represents precisely that principle which at once mediates and resolves the whole experience of that polarity, being that vital link without which the whole occurrence of divine self consciousness would not be possible. Um, I really caught the part where it says the names, including the supreme name, have relevance or meaning only within the context of the polarity, divinity, cosmos. So for me, what pops out is outside of that, there's no meaning, which was like just interesting to think about in general. Um, that there's no meaning at all. That the meaning is only contingent upon this polarity between this divinity and cosmos relationship, and that our role as humanity is to sort of be this, basically this representative or this medium between the polarizing relationship. um, so it does make me question the idea of when we search for meaning, are we approaching things incorrectly? Because if we are this mediator, um, between these polarity, it's almost like I don't even know how to. I'll leave it there, but I don't know. I hopefully you guys are kind of getting at where I'm going with this, but I'll pass it on to Dawood.
Sorry, it took a while to find how I can unmute myself. All right, thank you, Javier. It's good to see you all here, starting this book together. Uh, this is a book that, as you said, Javier, the first chapter is enjoyable, and one of the reasons why it is enjoyable is because it really anticipates how the book is set up. The book seems to be set up and divided on the basis of a series of characters or archetypes, beginning with Adam. And what Adam represents is represented in this chapter in terms of his role in creation. So it represents the creation of humanity, creation of human being. And as you said, Javier, that creation involves bringing in together polar opposites. So polar opposites that they were supposed to exist in separation from each other, like light and darkness, divinity, cosmos, matter, mind. I don't know how many more we can count, but these are infused together and bridged. These two sides are bridged. The idea is that what enables the bridging is the being of the human person. And that is also referred to in or described in terms of an archetype. That archetype, one of the features of an archetype is that it never exhausts itself. No matter how much we describe an archetype, it continues to give, continues to evoke images. And Javier, you also talked about meaning, and I think this is a way of thinking about human beings, the being of the human, that is, I think, endlessly meaningful. It endlessly stimulates images, and I also find it very engaging to think about human being as a kind of mirror, and mirror itself is one of those unity of unity of opposites, because when we are seeing something in a mirror, when we are seeing the reflection of something, we are not seeing the thing itself. We are not seeing the thing that is being reflected, but at the same time we are seeing. So it's seeing and non-seeing, visibility and invisibility come together in the function of a mirror. Yeah, so it's a I don't know where to go from there. That's just my initial thoughts on the chapter. I'm curious to see what others thought. Maybe Thomas?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I have notes from a while ago, so I have to pick it up. Where it is. Jyoti, can you go ahead while I'm pulling up my notes? I had them and I lost them. So apologies on me.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So it took me some time because there is a gap and the gap doesn't do good. So to get attune myself to the language and whatever is happening here. So it did take me time. So I think, Javier, the way you opened the chapter is very interesting, and I will just relate it to how I was reading this. So yes, I mean contradictions, and how do we should the word be reconciliation, or should there be some other word? So yes, as beings, we have a contradiction, and are we like constantly struggling with their reconciliation or something else? What are the knowledges then we are looking from there? And what I found interesting is somewhere on page 51, he goes on to talk about the knowledge and to uh, have a grip on this cosmos and all of maybe the contradictions. Just intellect is not enough, which then brings us to an interesting distinction which Krishnamurti also talked about, which between intellect and intelligence. So intellect might be something which is like rational, technical, helps you get jobs, get money, excel in this brutal world. But intelligence is more about a holistic being where your emotional self is also taken care of. Somewhere I find that so in the same language, so this knowledge cannot be arrived at by the intellect by means of any rational thought process, and he is advocating for a certain kind of perception which comes only by divine disclosure, from which is ascertained the origin of the forms of the cosmos receiving the spirits. And then on page 53, he goes on to talk about this particular knowledge, which then is more to do with one's relationship with God, with cosmos. And it is that relationship that plays a bigger and a better role, where he says that life is an intelligible reality as also knowledge, each being distinguished from the other. Life and reality is not then something out there. And similarly, in terms of the intellect, we know the world when we are not in relationship with the world, but maybe we need another kind of perception and the intelligence where knowing of the world demands your relationship with the world. um, Having said that, I'm wondering about your contradiction question and how do I weave that in with this understanding of knowledge that he's talking about. Yeah, Thomas.
All right, cool. Got my notes. So yeah, sorry, just because I did the reading from last week and I have my notes accumulated since then, so I just lost track where it is. And then I have my notes from you guys. I write notes when you are all talking with me, so that's why I'm all in a tizzy right now. A couple of notes. I mean, for me, I'll kind of give my commentary, and then we'll do our. I want to build on what everyone else is saying next. I think it's interesting where Ibn Arabi decides to start. So obviously, besides the name Allah, what name does it get chosen first to use? Is the real. the real to see his essence, reveal his mystery. I just think these names their orientation or ordering, I think, does have significance, just like this idea of life and knowledge. As Jyoti said, there's a correspondence, there's a kind of hierarchy of arrangements being talked about here. I think the notes about reflexivity or self-reflection, I think the note I had combined to what I had earlier was that the idea of the names is, there's a difference between a property versus the identity of the thing. So, for example, truth, beauty, goodness, justice, unifier, mercy. These can be both attributes that things can enact. So things can have truth, they have possession, or can enact, but that's not the identity. And that's kind of what's being hinted at here, but what makes Adam this unique entity in creation, because Adam is a creature. Because, by the way, in the kind of ontology of this way of thinking, there's angels. Angels are spiritual creatures. So what's up with that? And the text doesn't talk about this, but anyone who comes from a tradition understanding about Satan and Lucifer, basically he is contesting prophets, basically kneeling to Adam, and the argument being made, I'm made of fire, fire. This was made of clay. Why should I bend my knee to him? Now, it's interesting. I've been kind of meditating on this idea is that, fire it's a combustion activity. It's really an entity only in a very weird way. The fact that we see anything from flame and fire is just combustion procedures. It's not really an object. It's not a substance in the kind of real ousia way of like man. I've been just kind of meditating on that thinking or that idea about what is that kind of hidden wisdom about why Adam is considered a higher being than the angels. And the angels are pure spirit, pure intellect. I mean, anyone who's from a Christian point of view, or the Catholics, for example, and the Muslims too, angels are these hyper intelligent beings that can condescend down to us, but have an order of existence that's so much superior than us. They have pure intellect, and they can just cognize with each other perfectly. That's the accounts given for this. Versus us humans, we have to think through time. We have to use language. We have to use all these annoyances. Our knowledge is we're subsumed to error and all this other nonsense. So that's why it seems so. In one sense, you can say, well, yeah, you're right, Satan. Like, you're kind of right, Lucifer. It does seem a little bizarre. Why is Adam given this higher esteem to be the one to catalog all of existence, to be the angels have to bend to as well? And I think what's getting hinted at is this kind of self-reflexivity of not just properties, but identity. So every time you're doing something in the name of Allah and you're enacting it through the names done in the honor of God, you're actually honoring, glorifying, perfecting what God desires. That's one read of it. There's also, by the way, and I also bring this up because of the whole secondary part about universals. So this whole idea is that, right, where's honor? Where's truth? Like, where is this object in reality? It doesn't exist. Not in normal reality, not as an entity, but it only can be enacted through individuals, right? Through particular individuals enacting them. That's also why I bring this up. And that's also a way to meditate on this point is that, and by the way, the whole other idea is that ultimately this relation of the non-existent with the existent, right? This kind of reasoning through it to explain universals is pointing again at the mysteries of what's going on here and kind of shedding a light to why maybe Adam is given this high esteem as a seal of God, right? And as the original prophet in particular within the Islamic tradition. Also, just an open question. I've been just curious about it, right? The spirit is being talked about here as breath, right? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts about that, but I'm a little I don't necessarily know what that means distinct from soul. Christianity has a very completely different understanding, right? But I'm curious, anyone here can this text or can build any other secondary text to talk about more what is spirit being meant in this context. And that's what I got.
Okay. So this is going to be a little bit of a whirlwind with what you brought up, Thomas. And yeah, I got dogs in my room now. Come here, Samson. But so I recently been reading Perennialism Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Now he makes a very interesting note about pneuma. He says pneuma, if you translate it, and I forgot what language, but he says typically it can translate into castration, which is a very interesting one that I've never heard before. Now, the one thing that provoked me to think about the soul differently in this and the perennialist text, and then now reading the Adam chapter, is that Aldous Huxley says that the soul is innately feminine in contrast to the relationship to God. And that threw me in a whole type of whirlwind, because I understand it, and I'm looking at the Adam chapter like, okay, if we are the medium, as the archetype of this medium, then it seems like the task of human beings is to give birth to something, right? Like a woman that is pregnant, it becomes a medium for the child to come into being. And when I think about this more, if we really look at the way it described Adam, it not only described Adam as a mirror, but also the representative of the observing subject, which is it's just crazy to me that as an archetype of Adam, we hold both. We are representing both, holding the mirror and holding the observing subject. The other thing that I read made it seem more urgent about our role as human beings was how, if we don't act as these proper mirrors, then we risk, for example, it says here at the bottom of like page 48, it says, at one extreme of the relationship, cosmic nature threatens to absorb and assimilate the subject in the infinity and complexity of his creative urge, while at the other, the divine subject seems to annihilate nature in the reassertion of identity, each being at once another and non-other. Adam, as the archetype of humankind, is therefore in his essential nature at once the medium of sight by which the observing subject beholds his own cosmic image or reflection, and the medium of reflection by which the cosmic other is restored to itself. So when I read this, I feel like there is this great urgency to hold both these things, because if we fail to, one will basically annihilate the other, at least in this polarity relationship. I think I must be very careful about, like, when we talk about the unknown God would be unaffected, but strictly in this relationship between the divinity and the cosmos, we have a role to play that holds, protects the effacement from both, as being medium of the subject, of the eye of the subject, and being medium for the mirror. I don't know. I'm curious. I know that didn't, answer any of Thomas's questions, but I am curious about how that channels out. And the other question of meaning that I proposed was, it now that Jyoti brought that up about, this whole thing isn't an intellectual game. is the whole meaning game, is meaning itself an intellectual game that we play, or is it or should we think of meaning as a sort of medium of perception, which would be a totally different take on this. But yeah, I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I always thought about breath in terms of the animating principle, which isn't that original. But now that Javier referred to it, is describing it as kind of with the analogy of an act of impregnation. That's really interesting, because with that image, we are talking about something being received and a potential that can be actualized. It can also be thought in terms of something that one is borrowing, kind of a gift or something you borrow and then you work on it, you develop it. In a similar sense that a parent doesn't say this child is mine. It's like, it's literally me. There's a distinction between one and one's offspring. But in a sense, one's offspring is given to one. And it's a kind of complicated self-other relationship with that life that is given to us, with that new life. The relationship between creation and the one who is creating is itself, I really like Jyoti's reference to a relationship that is not intellectual, purely intellectual. It is a relationship that involves desire, involves the creator wanting something, wanting to be seen through something else. These are concepts. It's a language that is very involved, and we can see it in our own lives when we are making something, when we are working on a project. We are not having a detached intellectual relationship with the things that we are making. If you're really passionate about something, if you're really involved in it, if you're really interested in it, then it's an expression. We want to see ourselves. In a sense, we also want to see ourselves through the medium of art or through the medium of something that we are doing. So that passion is also there. We are, in that sense, an artist is reflecting the more divine kinds of creation. Now, one last thing I want to say about that reference to Satan. I don't know if you're familiar with this little book, Becoming Human by Jean Vanier. It's a really nice, short book. I just started reading it, borrowing from the library. So the author, Jean Vanier, he says that he's talking about the project of becoming human, just like the Adam. We can discuss that in terms of the archetype of the first human. So he said that this became an explicit project to him after decades of teaching philosophy and theology, very intellectual life, very detached, cold life. But he said, I started to become human when he started to live with a community of intellectually disabled people. So he says here, strangely enough, the process of becoming human occurred most profoundly for me when I started living with men and women with intellectual disabilities. So somebody like a devilish voice in that scenario, in that kind of scenario, will say, well, you are so much better than them. Why? What do you have to gain from that relationship? What kind of gift do they have to give you? So that's the voice of Satan, who says, you are better. Don't get mixed up with people who have these flaws, people who are closer to the ground. But then he said, for me, that process began when I started to think of the gifts that they were giving me after I would enter into a relationship with them. And he realized that they are so much more gifted than him in developing human relationships, in connecting, in being vulnerable. And so the completeness, gifts that you have already can combine with other things that we don't have. And that's kind of like coming together of polar opposites and creation of a more whole, a more balanced, complete human being. Yeah, I thought that's like the voice of Satan could come in that scenario and like tempt him to not get involved. Stay in your university. You're a professor. You don't need them. But he did, at least the narrative that he's sharing with us. All right, that's all for me now. Jyoti, please.
Yeah, very fascinating, Dawood. So, couple of things. It's difficult for me to weave in what Javier was saying. That's a little tough, but I just want to give some remarks. It's a very interesting metaphor of active impregnation that you both are talking about. And again, I would resonate what Dawood was talking. So, Khalil Gibran has this beautiful book where he goes on to say that your children might have come through you, but they don't belong to you. And again, the entire chapter one is constantly resonating of the same sentiment. Second thing, again, in anthropology, this entire question of knowledge and which becomes interesting, which I feel again maybe help us understand this relationship between divinity and cosmos, where today anthropology is trying to understand the linkage with philosophy. And unfortunately, we think anthropology is about epistemology, while philosophy will take care of ontological questions. But how ontology and epistemology they both get woven up, and like becoming human, there is a very fascinating work where again an anthropologist is working with an asylum, and when you go to conferences and academic circles you have to freeze the lives. And when he is working with this patient, when this woman is working, sorry, in anthropologist, and she's working with this patient who is struggling with mental trauma and all of it, for this anthropologist, it's not possible. And she wants to capture the flux over there, the fluidity over there, which in academic circles and conferences is not considered to have a rigor. What does then it means to her as an anthropologist, not just to capture the life which is being lived, in which when we look at something like abandonment, and she goes on to draw from, I'm sorry, maybe it's a little detour, but I found it fascinating. So she goes on to talk about Giorgio Agamben's model of bare life, and how some of the lives are expendables, and we can completely dispose them of, and disposable lives. And that's how we look at people who are in mental hospitals also, and then she says that even when we look at abandonment, somebody who experienced being abandoned, even going through the experience of abandoned has its own kinds of vicissitudes, where it's not just about you are being disposed of, but on the contrary, everyday life there are challenges and all those things. So even to be abandoned has a lot of other things also which needs care, which needs attention. And then it's the language of vulnerability and language of pain. How we only look at the world through a rational, technical language, but there is also another language through which maybe you can understand the world, maybe you can understand other people. Which then reminded me of Wittgenstein. It's like, my lover's arm is paining, but I can feel the pain in my arm. So is something like that possible? Then yeah, I mean, it is possible to experience that. About Thomas and the entire discussion on Satan, when I was reading it, it reminded me, I mean, it's a very fascinating question how Adam is at the top. How is he getting the highest esteem? I was thinking of William Blake, when I was reading through it, how good and evil come from the same tree. And then I would want to complicate what Dawood was talking, that is it the voice of the Satan that is saying that, oh, I am a scholar and I should not engage with that world? Maybe we need that voice inside us also. Maybe the origin of that voice is also important. To have intelligence, to have more holistic view, that voice also has a value. The more we shun away that voice, the more that voice like comes over and also dominates us. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think the idea of humility, right? As we talk about from the becoming human, the idea of, right, the fault of Lucifer was pride. So and also this idea of the arrogance of knowing, right? That you know all the possible, you basically know the dimensions of framing. Because actually, back to Javier's original point, right? That let's see, what was the note about that? Yeah, basically, names have meaning within a context. That's kind of the whole shtick of all this. I mean, the story of the faith of Islam in this case is the story. I gave you signs and you never listened. That's time and time again. That's report that's all over the place. So it's very much as this repetition of this point that the signs were given. It's there in a tongue, in a language you understand, that yet you don't understand. It's this kind of veil of the intention of the meaning. And actually, that relates to what Jyoti's saying, is that that's the point, is that beyond even this requiring intellect, right, in terms of calculation, this kind of reasoning, right, mode, it's never going to do it. It's a thing that has to be moved by, the note I wrote down was nous. Usually I understand it in that sense, but it is, I think you meant that, because I guess you said intelligence and intellect. So my brain's a little mixed up which one's which, but I usually say with nous or the heart. The heart's usually used a lot to talk about this, specifically a mode of faith that has to be moved through the person to ascend to these claims of what the meaning of these names mean. Because that's the thing, is that, it's true with anything. Any word any name has only meaning in a context. You have to be literate to the context. If you don't have that understanding, it's just, at best, it's gobbledygook. At worst, it's just invisible. Now, that's the thing what's funny, I was talking to a friend about this recently, actually my fiance, about this in a car ride. It's funny that, let's say you're driving with your friend or someone, and you point to outside the window as you're driving, like, oh, look over there. And then if the person looks and says, oh, what, there's nothing there. That's not really true. It's actually an artifice of putting a nothing, of a meaninglessness, because there's lots there. Buildings, trees, mountains, road. There's lots there. It's just not meaningful to you in that context. Another simple example. I have a glass of water, I put it in front of you. I ask, and you tell me there's nothing in there. That's true in one context of meaning, but lots of other ways that's not true at all. There's molecules. There's lots of other things in there. It's just a matter of the level of inference. It's just not meaningful. So I think that's kind of also the very powerful kind of through line of what's being said here, is that the significance to comprehend what is trying to be said here of Allah and God's names, beautiful names in his reality, is not a question of not being there. It's just a matter of people not being literate to understand it. It's no different than not being literate to read a language. If you give me some Tamil, I won't be able to read that, just as an example. Because I couldn't even say, it literally has no comprehension to me, because it's just marks on a page. That's it. That's no phonetic, no word meaning. As an example, doesn't mean there's actually nothing meaningful there. It's just not meaningful for me in that moment, and it's because I'm lacking literacy to understand it. That's all for me. I yield.
Now that Thomas has sparked some ideas in my mind about this, and Jyoti, I wonder, when we talk about the question of anthropology and philosophy, I'm starting to wonder now, why exactly is Adam on the top? And if it's because he has this reflexivity, I think it's because Adam, as an archetype, can take on a manifold modes of being. And manifold modes of being implies manifold modes of acquiring knowledge, of knowing. But I guess the real question is, what is the optimal mode of being that acquires you the knowing? And I think it does shed light on the angels here, where it says they're like purely intelligible beings, if I read correctly. But the reason why they have limitation, at least I feel like it said this implicitly. I don't think it said it quite clearly, but I would say implicitly it said that the angels, to a certain degree, don't know, and they cannot know. So they are restricted by their mode of being. But Adam knows all the names. So it implies to me that Adam can, as a reflective principle, can acquire multiple modes of being. And I think to tie in what Jyoti points out, to kind of make the devil thing good and bad at the same time, would be this, is that we need this act of discrimination to be able to know which mode of being we should be in. The problem with Satan is that he he discriminated, but he doesn't know the other modes of being. So he assumes, without a doubt, that he's a superior being. In some senses, he's right. In some senses, he's wrong. But it's our ability to discriminate that is a gift and a curse at the same time, because if we can discriminate properly, we'd understand that being this mirror, this medium of a mirror and a medium of the seeing subject, is the optimal mode of being for us as humankind to basically acquire knowledge and know. But we have to be able to discriminate and polish that up. And I feel like now, if I want to tie in religion, the purpose of religion is to give you, to enhance, to give you a sort of mode of being to enact and practice, to, clarify the mirror, essentially. And it's true, because now that I'm starting to think about this more, is like you cannot rationalize to somebody a mode of being that they haven't experienced. It's just not possible. I wouldn't be able to understand it myself. And I think you see this clearly in the story of the angels. You see this clearly in the story of Satan. Like, you cannot rationally explain to another human being why this mode of being is better than the other. It takes you automatically have to self-involve yourself in order to get a glimpse of what we're even talking about. And this is something that I kind of started, and again, what does this mean experientially, instead of always talking about it, theoretically, because this is what Chitano always brings up, is that, and I got this hint from Francis, the book that you read, Dawood, not exactly the book, but from the guy himself, where he talks about cultivating this idea of holy indifference. Holy indifference. And this is also similar to what Hindus and Buddhists say, where you have to cultivate a one-pointed mindset. Of course, this one-pointed mindset is towards God. But the very funny thing about cultivating a one-pointed mindset is that you fall into multiple paradoxes where someone could be like, okay, I'm just going to accept things. I'm just going to accept the present. But the funny thing is, when you catch yourself doing that, you're making the present and trying to force yourself acceptance. You make that the one-pointed principle in your life, right? So you forget, like, the whole point is God and not you trying to, but yeah, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I'm loving this. That's great. Thank you. I think you're right. We should think about Adam, the archetype of Adam, as the mode of being that is of the seeing subject, and at the same time the seen subject, the seen subject. Because in the story of Adam, the creation of Adam is being seen, being observed by the angels and by the devil. There is something that I'm really fixating on, something that Thomas said about this scenario of driving with someone. Hopefully I can talk about it in a way that eventually I can relate it back to our conversation, because I believe it is relatable. So let's go back to driving with someone, and one person is pointing to something and the other person tries to figure out what it is that you're pointing at. So we have played this kind of game. This is a way of being playful with a friend, with a loved one. You point to something and they turn in the direction of that thing. You pass by the thing and then you say, okay, you missed it. And the other person will say, what was it? It's like, nope, you missed it. And it might happen for a second time, for a third time. It might happen a few times. And each time it's like, yes, you are at the same time trying to talk about something. You're trying to make a reference to something. But just because the other person missed the object, missed the referent, doesn't mean that it completely failed. No, it didn't completely fail. Actually, now the point of the conversation becomes what it was that you missed, or one of the two parties missed. It refers, it's now I try to link it back to the theme in the Quran that Thomas mentioned. It's a theme of um, the Creator, God, is saying, look, I showed you all these signs, you didn't get it, you didn't understand it. And of course we might uh, interpret that naively in terms of a very disciplinary God talking down to us as, what were you doing? What were you thinking? You missed that. Or we can also interpret it in a more playful way. It's like, you missed it. But now we are having this conversation because you missed those signs. This is now a conversation that, even though the conversation is starting now, I'm going to tell you that we already have a history. So even though it is the first time that we are talking, I'm revealing to you that this is not the beginning. The beginning happened before. It can happen. Sometimes a charming person does this. I read in a book by two of the students of Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan had this habit of, every time a student would go to him and say, hey, look, I'm really interested in joining your seminars, Lacan would say, yeah, but he would not say, okay, welcome. Yeah, you can sign up. He would do something really charming. He would say instead, what took you so long? So that was like, wow, what a seductive mood. Because now the students will feel so special. We feel like, oh, it sounds like we already have a history. He was waiting for me to come. He was waiting for me to join the seminars. So he would do this thing of indicating that, yes, there's a memory already, even though you don't have the memory, but memory exists objectively in the world. The world has our memory. And parents might say these things about, might describe the world in terms of memory to their kids, even though the kids never firsthand experienced any of those kind of elements of history. For example, a parent might say to their daughter or son that your name belongs to your great grandmother or great grandfather. It's a kind of continuity in. So this is something is being created, even though you have no idea what it is that is being created. So yeah, I think that theme is there's so much more to it than like a disciplinarian warning. And I like those other, even though I might be reading into it too much. But anyways, Jyoti, please.
So, and thanks for that, Lakan thing, brilliant. So I was thinking of, I was trying to think what Javier was talking about, the beings that we have and how it becomes difficult to convey it to the other person. But I think the good extension of Thomas Carr metaphor is helping me get a grip of it. So yes, I mean, you are in a car and you say that you miss it, you miss it. It's like also different kind of beings that we have, where the other person maybe just keeps missing the beings that one is going through. But as Dawood was then talking about that, it's not that it is missed also. It's not that it's absent. After all, there is always, it lurks also. One is, even if one didn't see, yet one has an idea, which then is to do with something which I was reading on anthropology of pain, which is which I found very interesting and maybe relevant over here. When we say that somebody doesn't get the one's being, yeah, somebody doesn't understand, and you want them to understand, and it's like when language fails. It's very interesting that something like understanding goes beyond language. Also, most of the times you are being understood without language as well. The burden of making oneself understood is most of the times on the speaker, on somebody who wants herself or himself to be understood. But maybe the burden or the responsibility is much more shared. If understanding has to happen, if somebody, maybe if even if the other person missed the car view, yet the feeling of it, the way when Thomas was driving and the excitement was there on Thomas' face was enough to convey that what is it that was there. And maybe the same thing holds for the being also, that maybe one doesn't really have to convey or make oneself understood. It's something that can be perceived beyond the language of intellect as well. Going to the question of Javier now, where we are wondering about Adam and archetype of Adam as a mode of being. In my reading, I don't know, I was not able to, I understand with the discrimination bit, but to have one mode of being. In my reading, it was on the contrary, to be able to have this multiplicity, which then is a singularity that comes from the multiplicity, which then to me, Javier, goes back to your first question of contradiction. I think what makes Adam, and why Adam is on top, that he knows that Satan is also in the Adam, and he can't really shun away Satan. And maybe Satan doesn't know that. Maybe Satan doesn't know that Adam is in the Satan also, and that discrimination is not there. And maybe that's why Adam is on the top. So, I mean, what I'm struggling with is having this one mode of being. Is there ever a one mode of being? Isn't that oneness comes from this constant, we are in flux, and we have all these beings in us, and from those flux, from that, all those beings, something comes up. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah. So, but I love when idea, like when someone takes an idea and then runs with it even further. Always, that's my favorite part of these kind of conversations. So I'm glad my car example got carried over to a larger meaning significance. That was really nice, David. But Javier, so the first thing what you said about the angel versus Adam, and kind of building on what Jyoti said, is that, yeah, I had the understanding just on this particular point that, and you said it yourself, that Adam is the one who can convey all the names. He can embody all the names, right? Versus the angels are limited, which is also a fun side note for anyone in the philosophy of glimpses in that series. I had a fun little note in there commenting that I always thought it was super lame that Aquinas basically said, oh, the angels who explain them, they have potentiality. That's why. But it's very bizarre because then you have to explain like potentiality as a form. It's very weird. I never bought that. So this is I feel like this is a very tight demonstration. Oh no, angels are lacking. There's names they do not occupy. They do not have access to. They aren't able to enact them. It's a very straightforward demonstration of that. Adam is it's a special position because he has the capacity to embody all the names from God. And God is the actuality of all those names. He's not just a possession, the entity that possesses it. It is the identity of these names all in one for God himself. So I thought that was super nicely put together, as Javier said. I think this idea, by the way, this objective memory note, it's very rich. I love just, I want to just marinate on that a little bit, just as a note, what David said about that. I think that's actually, specifically that kind of presumed familiarity. You know, I actually think that's actually a very powerful lesson, just as an aside about the different faiths. You know, generally one of the critiques of Islam is this kind of law, very transcendent God that's like, we're just divorced from, and he just completely just crushes us at all times. But I actually feel like and that's not true though. Anyone who's actually studied the faith closely, you know, there is these moments of deep familiarity that, you know, God's closer to us than anything else that ever is possible. And I think memory is attached to that. So I love the drawing of these images of their parents telling you the story of your origin of your name, and you may not have any memory of it. But it's also it's a kind of presumed familiarity. And the Khan story is a great example of that too, by the way. It was outstanding. But it's also the kind of building of something that, you know, again, it's the, as we said, the kind of mode a lot of times people just collapse ontology into epistemology. Really, that everything about existence is just a question of knowledge, which I've always hated that, because I'm like, no, there's plenty of I think it's too easy to fall into a solipsism when you do that game. So I do appreciate that note from Dawood about that. You know, by the way, what Jody's saying about this kind of presumption of the presumption of to be understood, I actually do think that just building on that point about sharing the imperative to be understood is that idea of using the example from Dawood. If you point to something and it's missed, there's this kind of urgency. Isn't this kind of because compelling? And it's actually frustration of not having the understanding. And it's not just on the person who pointed and missed. If anything, the person who pointed knows. So they're the one in the possession of the knowledge. It's the person who missed it who's like, well, what did I miss? And then they get in the argument and they start yelling, and then it gets this whole kerfuffle is occurring because the one being communicated to is in a state of lacking of knowledge, and is almost like compelling. The same goes with a question. Anytime you ask a question, even though it doesn't have any, actually, and by the way, Jyoti's saying about it not being intellectual, remember, questions are not propositions. They don't have any truth value to them. But yet they have the power to compel movement. They compel discourse. I think that's actually a very interesting little note of what Jyoti's saying. So I just want to build on that. And that's what I got.
So there was concern from Jyoti about, having this one mode of being, and like, how do we make sense of this as movement, essentially, right? Because, and I think, it does say, like, in the text, like, Adam is this process of reflection and recognition, which is interesting because then it does imply like there is this movement going on. But then also the fact that Adam is this seal, and if the seal breaks, all cosmic becoming becomes destroyed. So it's like, it's almost like this is my input at this point. It's almost like we are the holders of, becoming, like becoming itself. We are like you could say the protectors of that becoming. But I do like this idea of, being a process of reflection and recognition, because then it actually goes into what Jyoti exactly was talking about this idea of like, you don't need to necessarily understand the language to understand somebody, which it shows how we don't always use language to understand each other, but we understand each other through like our reflective actions, like a face I make or something like that. These sort of minute expressions that I make, there are some mutual understanding across, various groups. And I find that interesting because it's like, even if I don't understand what this person is saying, I can understand to some degree. I can recognize. I have the ability to recognize. But I do like that process of, I guess you could say, we're in a constant process of reflection and recognition, and this is what allows us to have understanding and also kind of go above understanding. Now, I think we all love Thomas's example of the car and the nothing being there, which I know I brought up the meaning aspect several times, and it actually makes me question. So instead of saying mode of being, I'll say the mode of the knower, just to maybe make it less confusing. Is that in Thomas's example, let's say the mode of the knower, and I will probably elaborate on this example. Like, let's say I'm talking in the car with somebody, and he is daydreaming in the middle of my conversation to him, right? And then I say, "Hey, did you hear what I said?" He's like, "No, I was thinking about something else." And then he's like, "What'd you say?" And I'm like, "No, never mind. I don't feel like telling you," right? But here, at least for me, it's a very clear example about the mode of the knower. Because he was daydreaming, he completely missed what I was saying, because we were not on the same mode of knowing, right? He wasn't receiving what I was saying because he was not in a mode of listening going on. So, for me, this mode of knowing is perhaps like the most fascinating, like to me, because, the question that is kind of goes unanswered a lot of the times is that when we talk about philosophy, when we talk about religion, nobody talks about the mode of knowing too much. I know that Catholicism and Islam and stuff, they talk about this sort of contemplation aspect, which kind of has an approach to a mode of knowing. But the other interesting thing that I hope gets brought up in this book, but it may not be, is to really complexify this. It's not just, I understand that we're talking in abstract terms about Adam as being this archetype of humanity, but we also have to understand that there is a vast difference when we start talking about physical constitutions. And what does that mean in conjunction with a mode of knowing? How does that interact with this mode of knowing that is, pushed upon us? But also, how does it interact with our psychophysical constitution? The one thing that is interesting is what Davoud had brought up before when he was talking about the book about becoming human. Now, how the guy said he felt more human with, people that were, disabled, so, and I'm thinking about how, when those people are disabled, how do they reach a mode of knowing in dialect with their psychophysical constitution? For me, this really complexifies the problem of just Adam as an archetype of just, being this mirror and the eye of the subject. Because now we have the interaction of the psychophysical constitution of the individual. And I feel like it's also not enough to say that, well, you just need to eradicate. I mean, this is sort of in every spiritual book. You just need to eradicate your will and make it correspond to God's will and so on. But just because it corresponds with God's will doesn't mean that there's some psychophysical limitations and interactions that are going to be involved in that. But yeah, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, Javier, as you were talking, I remember something else, a previous conversation we had as you were talking about knowing, modes of knowing. And I'm, in combination with that, I'm now thinking whether it's useful to use, it would be good to use the archetype of Adam when we are relating to other people. Like, for example, thinking of myself in terms of Adam, thinking of another person with the archetype of Adam, seeing the Adam, just like seeing the devil in somebody, seeing the Adam, this relatively, pure the person who is just come into existence, confused, combined with a desire to be seen, with a desire to know. When you were talking about different ways of knowing, I thought I remembered a previous discussion where you shared the experience of standing next to your uncle looking at a bunch of plants. And you said that your uncle is really interested. Is like he has acquired a level of expertise in this discriminating between plants. And I've had lots of experiences like that because I have no idea about lots of things. So when I'm next to somebody looking at something that they are interested in, like cars, for example, or like plants, like different kind of pottery, I stand next to the other person who's very different, has different tastes, different ability to recognize distinctions. And I can't see what they are really, even though the thing is right there in front of us. I can see what they are pointing at. Yeah, it's a piece of pottery. It's like a bowl. I can see it, but I can't see the point. And I think it requires a kind of movement from my way of being to the way of being that is the other person, that is the point of view of the other person. And I think maybe that is part of the essence of this archetype of Adam. The person who has the potential to move from where he is, where she is, to the perspective of somebody else, so that some other things are revealed to him or revealed to her. This person who is not knowing initially, but then can potentially know. So to respond to GOT's point about being one thing and being fixed, I think it is one being, but it is not fixed. It is the being that can move, can always move into perspectives that sees different things, recognizes different things, like the perspective of the uncle. So it is the ambassador. It's I forgot how it is translated, but the original name is Khalifa of Allah. It is the kind of I forgot the kind of like replacement, the person who represents someone. It's kind of on behalf of the king, on behalf of the creator. Adam is put on earth to do things on behalf of the creator, as a kind of the middleman or the mediator. The mediator might be a better word. So yeah, that movement, that opening up through the movement is important. I'll keep thinking about that as we keep going. Jyoti, please.
Yeah, Dawood, I think this is brilliant. When we see Adam in us and when we see Adam in other, that is something that actually allows for the movement also. And so, and at that point, when we have to, I mean, even in anthropology, it's about why do we look at that thing, at that person, that field as an object from where knowledge has to be extracted, where that becomes knowledge and a mode of knowing, which becomes different from mode of being. If one hears you carefully, of course, they both feed onto each other. They both support each other. And the moment one sees Adam in oneself and the Adam in the other, there is also the point that comes where when you are with the other, you see oneself in that other. And maybe that game is played by Adam, as you were just talking about, who is then the mediator over here. And Hivya, this question again goes back to my initial comment of anthropology and philosophy. And if we talk about this connection where we have to know the world, know the field in relationship with it, it has a bearing on the mode of being also. After all, when I'm understanding a field, understanding someone else, that understanding has a power to modify my stations of my being. That flux and then that movement is very much woven. The moment I build an opacity between me and the other, and that other can be a lover, can be a field, can be object, can be anyone. The moment we I build a layer, a block, the moment an opacity comes, then that knowledge cannot really have any way to support my being and also to support the movement of the being, the stations that it is supposed to go through. And I have been thinking about this question because of a brilliant book that I'm reading on this question of anthropology and philosophy, The Ground Between. And the book goes on to talk about the opacity which is not just there between you and the other, you and it can be anyone, lover or whatever, the person sitting next to you in the car. That is only a reflection of the opacity that is inside you, when one has also built an opaque layer inside oneself, when one can't even talk to one's own private self. The moment one is able to have that communication within, there is also the language of pain, language of vulnerability, which might not be possible in field notes, which might not be possible in through the language, but yet it is there. I mean, how does it happen? At times people don't say, at times your students don't say anything, or friend you doesn't say anything, but you see the friend and you know the pain. So of course there are other ways, something which he was talking about, that how the knowledge can be arrived solely by the intellect, but the power of the perception that comes. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, the bill's being said, the idea of being moved to understanding, right? That could be an emotional understanding, right? So these basically non-linguistic, non-propositional statements, but even just propositional statements. How many times you gotten, I always say sometimes when there's conflicts with people, one of the worst things they do is try to deal with an emotional conflict with propositional statements. Not going to work. Even if you're valid, it's completely valid statements you're making. The ground, the dimension of actual conflict is not on propositional statements. It's on emotional or some other properties or domains. But the basic issue stands of being moved to understanding. So I really do appreciate Zavud's commentary on it, because remember, I do think that's ultimately what a substance can do, is it can contain contraries. So we can be hot and cold, like we can go over all the properties. But of particular here, I think also my readings from Aristotle, the ideas of, rational acts is when the rational agent is able to choose to do action or not the action, or to be moved to take it in or not take it in. In fact, actually one of the moments of kind of trustworthiness or kind of a fidelity to truth is that when you're given propositional state, when you're given the arguments, you should take it seriously and you need to be willing to be moved. And a dialogue does not work if you're not willing to be moved by what's being presented in front of you. So I'm just thinking about these notes of kind of coloring of free will, like kind of, again, what is the essence of Adam? I'm just kind of drawing it up, is not just rationality. That's not good enough. No, we're talking about, I think it's deeper. I think it's free will. It's kind of that quality that's being discussed here a little bit more. And by the way, what Javier is bringing up with this question of what is the motive of knowing for the disabled, we got Job in here. Job is in the text. We're going to talk about the archetypes of completely irrational, unjustified suffering of the most moral agent. I'm using the most upright, righteous man to be completely decimated, completely destroyed, and taking everything from him away. And the kind of opaqueness of the knowledge of this. It's very Job is there, and he's here. He's one of the archetypes. He's one of the gems. So I definitely think that's where we're going to get our answers from Job. That'd be the short answer to that. So I'm looking forward to reading it. Because by the way, I mean from the Old Testament stories of Job, from that I love that, because his friends come and they got to sit there and give the justifications. God comes back and says, "All you are wrong. All you got to pray to Job." And remember, Job is like basically like, remember, he's like in full agony. He's like, "Just kill me." He's straight up saying, "Kill me. I'm done with this." But he never forsakes God. He never does it. I think it's quite the character demonstration, especially when it's unjustified, irrational suffering. Like, yeah, we kind of know because it's part of a larger bet that was made that we're aware of, but Job has no idea. No one on the ground has any idea that's what's going on here. And even then, it's actually even worse in one sense that we're given our perspective as readers, because we're like, oh, this is a huge game. Like they're just like taking Job, the most devout of the believers, and just saying, nah, just told. I mean, in one sense, it's like God's so confident, he has foreknowledge and know God of Job's devotion. He'll never forsake him. So it's part of like, yeah, do whatever you want with him, won't matter. The other side is like, wow, talk about just chess pieces, just complete dismissal. It's almost like the worst fear we have, that God treats us as ants of like complete insignificance, and they'll just do whatever we want with you. Anyways, I'm just ruminating. This is not what the text is saying. I'm having some fun just painting the picture of modes of we should be kind of dumbfounded. Like Job should be the archetype example of us dumbfoundedness when we're seeing the face of God, and it's in his potential majesty, his awesomeness, like in what he can do to us if so chosen. So that's all I got for now. I yield.
Can I jump in? Yeah. So Thomas, I don't know if I get it right or not, but I would little shy away from intellectual and emotional. After all, emotional is in the intellectual very much, and I mean I'm struggling with this question, so it's a very tentative argument. So I have two things to say over here. Just yesterday I was talking to my friend who was having a fight with her boyfriend, and it just came to my mind now, and she was telling her boyfriend she was pretty hurt and all of it, and she said it's not that I don't understand his rational argument, and he won the argument. Even I knew from the beginning where I was wrong, but he won the argument, but she lost me. And I just got it. Not lost me, like not that they are having a breakup or whatever, but lost me in the sense that she was hurt by the end of it. And she was trying to say that there is more to just winning the argument, stating the propositions. And when she was saying that, I was being reminded of an article where this woman was extending Butler's argument of politics. And when we are talking about politics, we become, and in academia also, the scholarly argument becomes so brutal, so dispassionate, that they are devoid of any element of care, attention, and empathy. It's like, you see somebody and you have to like chop, 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 in conferences, in intellectual circles, just to win over the argument. And because of that, one has, at least in India, you have like, different kind of cliques and circles and politicizing of the groups which happen, which I for me is an offshoot of that. And here is this woman who was developing this idea that, can we think of politics with care? Why can't the element of empathy and care be in the politics also? And I would say, why can't it be there in any kind of intellectual argument also? Even when you have to win over an argument, can it be done with an acknowledgement of the other, acknowledgement of the differences? Yeah.
Thomas, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to clarify, I don't think we're in disagreement, because I was saying that there are different. I only meant that in the sense of exactly what you're saying, is that people will go and confront things on the intellect, on the justification side, on a deductive propositional statement level, but that's actually not the domain of the actual conversation. So, no, so I'm not in disagreement with what was being said there. In fact, actually, most of the time in interpersonal communications, that's the problem. You think you're going to solve this problem by some propositional statement, but in actuality, the heart was not one. And that's actually where really the domain of where their understanding needs to come from. So that was just to clarify, like there was no disagreement. We were saying the same thing. I mean, just to build on what's being said is that, this idea of communicating on the heart is a very, well, shall we say, actually, one of the things I'll say this, ultimately, I think sometimes a lot of times what people forget is that sometimes we need to be reminded of the reason we're in conflict in the first place, and that maybe the conflict is not as adversarial as possible. So, for example, like if in politics, for example, if people came in there with a real good faith, literally good faith position of, we want to come to the truth, and I'm willing to be moved by hearing your arguments if you're willing to hear by my arguments or statements, and we can work together to come to the truth, because maybe we're both right, maybe we're both wrong. Actually, it's one of my favorite examples. Actually, the biggest issue when people get in arguments, maybe you're both wrong. It's actually, and actually takes a degree of humility to even acknowledge that. But that's the thing, is that what needs to be there is not just the propositional statements, but some good. Like, why are you arguing in the first place? Because there's some good involved. There's some truth. There's something of the heart at stake here that needs to be reminded sometimes. And then people don't realize there's two domains going on. I'm only saying two domains because there's a artifice to explain what I meant, but people do. Because yes, the emotions are cognized, right? We have words to attach to it, and they're very much part of our cognitional process. So yeah, in reality, they're intermixed very clearly. That's what causes the problems, is that people will try to make things, removing the emotion, not realizing they're very much in there. And if you don't address it, it just explodes in your face 10 times worse, and doesn't seem to do anyone any good. So that's all for the secondary reply.
That that's typically like one of my biggest critiques about philosophy, is that in my opinion, like, philosophy is that thing, like, you can twist any way you want. Like, if you really get good at it, you can twist anything, any proposition you want the other way around, and just show a weak argument. You really have that capacity to do that. And it reminds me of like that wonderful snippet. I always bring it up with it, that Dawood shared on his Twitter. It was a movie, I believe, or show, where a couple are going to therapy, and like the guy is like, "What do you mean by like rationalize? What do you mean, like, am I doing? Like asking all these questions and so on." And he's totally like missing the point, like just missing the point. And I think when Thomas, you bring up like, well, you're both wrong. I think that's exactly what happens. Is like, people get into these intellectual conversations, and in reality, is like they both miss the point. And so, I really love what Dawood said about, this movement, and I think that's actually what shows why we are like, you know, on the top, because we can move, and that's what creates understanding. One of the first things that God said to the angels when the angels were kind of like questioning God's decision to make Adam, God said, I know and you do not know, right? So he's saying like you're not going to understand and you're not going to know, right? But Adam's going to know all the names. So I'm getting that Adam's going to be able to understand. Of course, the real question is, how does Adam reach this mode of understanding? What is the way to know? What is the way to know? What is the real movement between, you know, the divinity and the cosmos? But what you said on Thomas, what you said about Job, yeah, you know, Job. This is going to be a little bit of a side note here, but actually, I think that just reading the story of Job actually answers the problem of evil, in my opinion. It actually answers the problem of evil because it's a lot of what Job goes through is a lot of what people traditionally complain about concerning God. Why? Why is this happening? Why can't I be mad at God? Well, Job was allowed to. Job thought that he was going through a real injustice, you know? And for me, this is a lot of what Job actually said is is very familiar to what a lot of atheists say. You know, why, if there is suffering, why did he let it happen, right? And why does it exist anyways? You know, I'm a good person. Why does this happen to me? You know, so I think the story of Job, if people actually look close to it, it may not. I think the problem of evil is that people want a specific rational answer. The story of Job does not provide that kind of rational answer. It simply shows that only God can speak. Anybody else that tries to speak for God essentially fails. And this is what I love about all the friends trying to justify, you know, and this is what a lot of people kind of throw away from religion, is that, you know, they talk about their interactions with like other Christians or Muslims when they go through suffering, and like the Muslim or the Christian will be like, well, it's probably because, you know, you've been in a life of sin lately, so that's probably why, you know, you're going through what you're going to, so you should probably ask for forgiveness and you know, and get closer to God, right? This is exactly what Job's friends were saying to him, right? But you can see how, as human beings, we don't want to accept that, because I think ultimately there is this idea that we kind of intimately know that something isn't right here. Something isn't right with this depiction about trying to speak for God. So I do find that fascinating. I know I kind of went off topic there a little bit, but yeah, I do hope that the rest of the text kind of tackles and I think it does. I think all the other prophets will reveal the sort of psychological nature of them that is particular to them. And I think Adam is just the most broad, the most just fundamental basis. So that will be interesting to show how that reveals itself, and how even when we study like saints and mystics, they all have different personalities and just different, you know, you could say understandings. And I think Ibn Arabi would say this is because they're ranked in degrees, which, you know, that, for me, that's a fine thing. But I guess if I want to talk about the universal and the individual together, is, you know, taking the Adam function. I understand that we're supposed to be like this mirror, medium, subject for the eye, and so on. But I wonder, as individuals, if it's supposed to be like within my own capacity, right? I can only be a mirror within my own capacity. The real question is, what does that mirror look like within my own capacity? Because I am very, interested about, and I feel like this is the problem of anthropology when they're trying to understand and incorporate philosophy, is that with anthropology, you're dealing with a variety of people with different psychophysical constitutions. And then you're trying to answer the questions of epistemology and ontology, and then you're trying to incorporate philosophy, but philosophy doesn't most of the time account for psychophysical constitutions. It doesn't in my opinion. The only people that did were like psychoanalysis, like Jung, Freud, to some degree, and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm interested to know how that turns out. But yeah, I'll pass it to Dawood.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what you said last, Javier, is also relates to what you said previously about speaking on behalf of God, and even more specifically, speaking on behalf of other people, speaking on behalf of other people's situation. Because a philosophical viewpoint many times wants to present itself as speaking for all of us, regardless of our differences, physical differences, psychological constitutions, as you said, build up different ways in which we are positioned in the world. Doesn't want to admit the importance of that. That's why philosophy, I don't want to generalize this to all of philosophy, but some of the students of philosophy tend to make this mistake of having something to say about everything. What about the art of being quiet occasionally? What about that art of like saying, you know what? I'm really moved by this. I want to be quiet for 2 minutes. That's really something that is not explicitly encouraged in philosophy. Philosophy really wants to be sufficient. This is something I learned from the French philosopher, contemporary philosopher, Francois Laruelle. He has criticized what he calls principle of sufficient philosophy. This attitude that philosophy is enough. Philosophy can solve all of our problems, or at least formulate and give us some anticipation of a solution. But that art of, and that's another reason, by the way, why I don't see theology as a proto-philosophy, as a less advanced version of philosophy, because theology has those elements of not speaking for somebody else, not speaking for somebody who is other, for a being that is totally different from on behalf of a being who has that opacity, initially at least, or in the case of Job, that I'm happy Thomas brought into the conversation already. Job represents somebody who just hits against opacity and will never get past it. So what to do with that otherness that will never go away? In that sense, we can, and then we are, because of that stubborn opacity, we're filled with the urge to interpret it, to make sense of it, to say something about it, to at least explain it away, even if we cannot physically, ontologically push it away, but at least we want to make sense of it, subsume it at least into our minds. But that is exactly what we should resist, and not say anything, and say, okay, you know what? I can't speak on behalf of this thing that is happening. I am just me. And that's, again, relates back to something that you said previously, that this portion of the universe, Adam, maybe that limitation of the archetype of Adam is maybe that is a little bit too solipsistic. It stands against entirety of the universe, entirety of the divine. But in our world, we have different human beings, and each human being has their own purview, which is why the theological stance would say the loss of like these tragedies, like school shootings, a theological stance would really, a religious stance would reveal to us the profound tragedy of these events, like the loss of a life, loss of a human life, especially a premature loss of a human life. It's profoundly tragic. Whereas a non-religious materialistic attitude, like based on primarily evolutionary theory, might say, yeah, we replicate, we live, lots of human babies, and then some of them will be lost. So that's very not as sympathetic. So it's like the vulnerability of religious attitude. A religious attitude is supposed to, I think, make us more vulnerable, make us more susceptible to be moved and to be hurt. And I love that Thomas's reading of the free will as free, not just to be powerful over other things, but the freedom to be moved by events that happen, that we undergo. Anyways, thank you. Jyoti, please.
I think I need a week, to process all this. So just completely some rough thoughts, and I'm gonna mull over it over the week. This is interesting of theology and philosophy, and maybe this is what something that modernity has brought on itself. And I'm just reminded of Foucault, and I need to go back to Foucault when he was talking about that the major distinction that has come is not really between spirituality and science. This is in hermeneutics of the subject, but it is actually between spirituality and philosophy. At what point this distinction came between spirituality and philosophy? After all, it was always woven within it. Philosophy was something that was always supposed to respond to it. At what point it became devoid of it? It became this rational, technical, and devoid of this quiet, um, this silence, this pain. And then when you were talking about this philosopher, Dawood, and how philosophy is about having a grasp over all and know it all, I'm like can be completely wrong over here. I was thinking of Heidegger and this recent book that I was reading on Heidegger, and he was talking about philosophy as a certain kind of homesickness, an urge to be at home everywhere. And he says this is where we are driven in our homesickness, to being as a whole. Our very being is this restlessness. And how we are always trying to move from this restlessness to a certain station, to a certain being where we are always feeling at home. Can we then relate this idea of to have a grasp over everything with what you were talking about, David, earlier, of finding Adam? Of finding Adam also almost everywhere in every being. And maybe that's what philosophy initially it was meant to be, but of course with time it got detoured and it lost or it's lost way or something like that. What I wanted to pay attention to, and now I'm trying to make some connections. So on page 55, he says, first para, he ends, if we witness him, we witness ourselves, and when he sees us, he looks on himself. And to me, again, this was related to the what you were talking about, Adam, and how maybe that becomes a mediator, that becomes a point through which maybe all of us come together and we can have a language which goes beyond the rational technical language also. Yeah, I think that's it. Just some rough thoughts. Yeah.
To build on what's being said, actually, about what, first of all, one was what Jyoti said. I instantly, with the Heidegger homesickness, Augustine came out to my mind. My heart was restless until I rested in thee, God. So that's just a very first thought that came to my mind. The other part related kind of secondarily with that is, my favorite thing about theology in general is the permission to let mystery exist. Isn't that the fundamental difference? Every other mode of investigation will never accept mystery. In fact, actually, a mystery is the call for investigation. It's the imperative to go and solve the mystery. We gotta break the mystery, the crime scene, the crime mystery. Take your pick. It's the imperative to compel to go break it apart. So first of all, theology is the one domain of knowledge that allows for mysteries to exist, right? And to actually meditate, contemplate, and reflect on the mystery, not to attack it, destroy it, tear it open, come around, just possess it, kind of a knowledge of possession mode. The other note, by the way, I appreciate that you really were moved. You appreciate that idea of free will as being free to be moved. Right? I would actually we can combine these two ideas and say, ultimately kind of what the religious life is one to be is to be free to be moved by the mysteries of life. So this idea of the stillness, the peace, the quiet, the kind of witnessing, this kind of apprehension, contemplation, apprehension mode of cognition right? What is prayer too? So what also remember way back like weeks ago in the book club when we had this whole discussion about the difference between propositional statements and prayer. It's kind of pointing to this exactly the same phenomenon. It's kind of raising the heart and mind to the mysteries of existence, and particularly being free to be moved by it. Because you can either look at these things and go, "Oh, we got to know the reason for Job's suffering." So that's a mystery. This is exactly what one would do a prayer to, and do a kind of meditation and a kind of contemplation of the mystery of Job. It's not a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be contemplated, which requires a kind of quiet stillness and peace in one's heart to come to understand that. So I think that's probably the things I can add right now in this cycle. I thought I yield.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like most people, I feel like, at least the people I've talked to, most people would say that if you accept a theological position, you're actually accepting a worldview without mystery. But I think they're wrong in this situation, because even if you accept, right, let's say a God that exists, there's just so much that you just don't understand. I mean, it's so mysterious. One thing that I like about the Catholic side is that, when you're doing like the rosary, you have to contemplate on the mysteries, right? Like, it's part of the act. You have to contemplate on the mysteries of Jesus being resurrected. Like, they don't understand that. Now Islam has a different point of view on that. That's a whole different, ball game. But just the fact that you are encouraged to contemplate on the mystery. And one of my favorite lines from Rilke, and also, I love saying this line, is that when Rilke says, "You must live the questions now, and hopefully you will find the answer." I think in some ways, I think that's what it means to actually cultivate this holy indifference, is that I don't know. And maybe I do know, but ultimately I don't know. So you have to live this question rather than demanding an answer. And I think when Adam is in this mode of being a mirror, it is like living, being an active living of the question, but at the same time, like, the answer reveals itself. But of course, the reality is that we're doing it through time. So it is like a slow revealing, but I want to say ultimately the question is the answer. And Heidegger, ironically, made this distinction that actually the answer is always in the question, which I always loved that what he did. And I really love that you brought up Heidegger, Jyoti, because to connect it to Dawood's, idea of like silence, sometimes we don't have to answer. Heidegger always did these like mysterious like provocations where it's like, no, but we can't say it. We can't speak of it. Like, I love his interview with the I think like one of the monks or something. And the whole like dialogue is so attractive to me because I get nothing out of it. It's just them talking back and forth. Like, if they have like some secret with each other and they say, yeah, but you can't say it. The whole time they're like, yeah, but we can't speak it, because if we say it, it's gone. you know and that's what I really liked about Heidegger as a philosopher, is that he really pressed this idea of mystery kind of implicitly, that it just kind of really almost, and I think that's what ironically drives people away from philosophy, is that they are looking for answers. But the thing is, philosophy doesn't ever get you answers. Now, there are people that go into philosophy to construct a complex system that will give you answers, but I don't know. I mean, if we just look at the very fundamental beginning of philosophy, at least from the West, right? We talked about Plato and Socrates. Socrates always did this sort of, redirection. He almost did this like self-reflection of your questions, and I wonder if that's, how we should always be interacting with the mysteries. is this sort of self-reflection back. And I think Socrates did this really well in his dialogues with other people, when they would ask questions thinking like they know and acting like they know. And I think actually the genesis of Satan and Adam is that actually God does this Socrates move with Satan. He's like, well, you don't know, man. You don't know. So I do find that fascinating. But yeah, I think we'll do one more round.
Great. Thank you. I don't think I have much to add. I'm also happy that Jyoti brought Heidegger in. I think one of the abilities of great philosophers, and the reason why it is such a delight to be in their presence and read their works and read Heidegger himself, as opposed to like a watered down introduction to Heidegger, or watered down introduction to Nietzsche, is that we get access to that vibrant, energy that Heidegger speaks about, the desire to feel at home, that the desire, the homesickness. And I remember Heidegger's book on Nietzsche. He begins that way. He begins discussing Nietzsche in such a way that makes you fall in love with Nietzsche, with philosophy, with everything, with like being able to read a book. I remember how privileged I felt, like, oh my God, I'm so glad to be able to read this, to have this book. That's what Heidegger does. I think that's what any great philosopher does, a great thinker. I mean, I don't attribute that to them being philosophers per se, but they're doing something. They're maintaining access to the mystery, as Thomas said. In discussing Nietzsche, he also said, our aim in this like study of Nietzsche's will to power is to feel at home in thought. I was like, what an invitation. What an invitation to, anything like a philosophical project. But the beauty of that is that you don't have to go through that path. That's a kind of thing that Ibn Arabi is doing too. So anyways, that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that sentiment. I mean, this is just a book on boredom. He's talking about boredom, and when I was reading it, it's like overwhelmed. It's like you are holding the most sacred thing around, which is possible. I'm gonna read this thing again because there's a lot on mystery and being, and I really want to mull over it. But I was just wondering that it's not just that it is mysterious and we let it be. Of course, silence is a way of knowing something also. We should not be always be anxious to capture it, extract it. But knowing the mystery, after all, what drives us as human beings? It's always this uncanny, the uncanny which is outside us, which is inside us, the mystery of our being and the mystery outside. In fact, one of the reasons that why there is a larger pathology of always, I mean, this is something that Stiegler talks about, that we are always exhausted. If one thing that stands for today's times is exhaustion, we are always exhausted. And you talk to anybody, friend, colleague, family, and one thing that we all say that, oh God, I'm so tired, which seems to be our human condition today, which is again to do with the fact that actually, I mean, I was wondering, I can be completely wrong, there isn't much mystery left. We think we know everything, and we think there is nothing which needs to be known, and whatever is to be known is to be extracted, to be profited from. It's not, but yet, I mean, our relationship with mystery, and I'm reminded of Veena Das, again an anthropologist, who when sits in a field, who says that one of the job of anthropology is to capture the uncanny, and to capture the uncanny mystery is not to run after it, get the data, ask the right question, just to witness, just to be there, and to know that data will come to you. You don't have to run after the data. Whatever is lying over there, all of it will come to you in its own ways. Somewhere I find it is that language which is missing over here, and then how do we understand mystery? So I'm going to think more about it in this week. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, to close out and build what's being said, but I had a note here about, isn't it interesting when we don't, and I'm glad Jody said it, by the way, explicitly what I was going to say. Isn't it fascinating when the mysteries of life are taken away there's a deadness to existence. It's just like we're stuck with this, like, and I kind of building what and Dabu said too. I mean, straight up, like we get mass murders and people go, self-selection, natural selection. What are you going to do? Just a pile of meat, just a bunch of us here. What's the difference? Us of atoms over here versus there. What's the difference? Versus a kind of sacredness, a kind of aliveness, a kind of vibrancy. It's almost, you could almost say you can make an argument. You could say maybe the purpose of this entire mode of discourse or investigation is not to have knowledge, to know, to have certainty, like the project of philosophy he said to do. Instead, it's to develop a kind of mode of vibrancy and aliveness to existence. And even the best thinkers, are not really that interested per se in certainty, gaining perfect understanding and certainty and possession, but instead a kind of vibrantness of homeness of thought, just being happy in the thought. For example, as what Dabu quoted, and also, by the way, when Javier said the Heidegger interview with a monk, I read that text for the Johannes class. I remember talking to the group. We were like, "Oh man, that text was like a spring water. It was like fresh spring water of the mind. It was delightful." And it's true from a raw, what was the information? What was the extraction? Like, there wasn't that much to distract, but you got this very painterly kind of composition. It actually did feel like I was like in a landscape, in an open field, basically, right? With the morning dew, a little sparkle in the sun, a nice cool breeze coming by. I mean, look at the way I'm talking about it. Like there's like lots of texts I've read. Like I read the Oregon. I'm like, okay, yes, this is the proposition. This is a noun. Yes, like it's a very different experience. So I think the question of, what is the distinction of I think a good philosophy or even good theology is ones that kind of engender mystery, because our lives are very much dead without it. It perhaps maybe to bring us all full circle. Is that what spirit is in the end? Is it mystery? Is that what it is? From my question from the beginning, just saying, because if the spirit is it's a living activity, and the thing we know that gives us our living activity or kind of vibrancy and energy is when we are free to be moved by the mysteries, versus when they're absent, we're just dead. We're just dead matter, just kind of collapse. I hope I kind of close off with just a question from the beginning, and that's all from me.
I really love what everybody said today, and Jyoti really capitalized what I had been thinking about like weeks before, but I totally forgot about it until she brought it up now, is that in order to understand things, and this has been the biggest philosophical question since the beginning of time, how do we know things in themselves? And I think here Ibn Arabi gives the answer. To know things in themselves, you have to be this reflecting recognition principle, which is the archetype of Adam. So, and now when we talk about mystery, I'm starting to think that meaning, the reconstruction of meaning, is not an answer, but is a relationship to the mystery in a mode of witnessing, which I believe that is what meaning encompasses. Meaning, I would say true meaning encompasses the relationship with the mystery in a mode of witnessing. But if we talk about philosophy, I think this proves the superiority, my God, of phenomenology, because phenomenology is claiming to let things appear as they appear to themselves, as they are. And I think that the Adam function is basically a phenomenology. That's what that's what it would be. Now, what would be interesting to add the question is there a difference between what phenomenology claims and what the archetype of Adam is trying to be? Because phenomenology is claiming to allow things to reveal themselves as they are. And I feel like the function of Adam is to reveal things as they are by being this mirror and recognition. So is there a difference? I believe there is, but I'm going to leave that for myself to simmer on, because I think it's an important one. But I think we're on the right track of, at least I think now I've answered to myself through you guys that the reason why I like phenomenology is that it does have this spiritual take of letting things be as they are, and that's how we know. That's how we recognize. Because the moment we start interacting with something, we start extracting it, we start moving it. This is the problem of uh, quantum physics. They're like, the moment we do this, it moves, and we don't understand like if it's us or if it's the thing. So with that, I'll leave it open for final comments, and yeah. All right, if you guys are good. All right, that will
Thank you.
end our session.